Hey fearsome friends. The spooky season has begun. I love this time of year. Be sure to take a look at my limited edition Halloween merch. The links are in the description below. Kidnap. We've all had times where we've felt vulnerable as children and adults, and it's sad we have to go through that. Here are 14 stories of people who have, in quite extreme ways. So sit back, relax, and get cozy, comfy, warm, because it's time to let your nightmares in. I grew up in an upper middle class family. My dad was a young professional, and my mum was next level, taking care of 3 kids and being a GM for my dad. Then it all hit the fan and they divorced. At that time I was in junior high, grade 7 or 8, and I had recently gotten bus privileges. So I was busing to school back and forth on my own with no issues, being an independent teenager and giving my mom a break. Now the bus picked me up and dropped me off at the exact same point, which was an intersection on a main road which intersects with my residential road, and was literally a 1-minute walk to my house. Growing up, my mum talked to us about stranger danger. Yet despite that, I'd led a fairly sheltered life up until that point. I was overall a very talkative, nice kid, and could strike up a conversation with anybody. Usually my guard wasn't really up per se, and I tended to trust everyone, even if I'd met you for the first time. On this fateful late afternoon, the bus dropped me off at the usual spot. I was minding my own business, making my way towards my street, when I heard the voice of a woman say, little boy, it's cold outside." I turned around, and that's when I saw this white cargo van, and the woman was practically leaning out of it. She was dressed rather nicely, all in black, was fairly young, and had a nice big smile. The cargo van doors were completely swung open, and she was leaning out. Now I strongly believe in a sixth sense, your gut intuition, or whatever you want to call it, and my gut was telling me to get home, to walk faster and to create distance. "It's cold outside. Let us drive you to your house," she said. "No, it's fine. My house is just down the street," I pointed. She was persistent. The van slowed down some more. She was leaning out further, and I was practically walking on the gravel at this point. She kept on talking to me, but I was no longer listening. But I wanted to get a better look. I wanted to see what she was trying to hide inside the van. You see, she was leaning in such a way where she was obstructing my view of what was inside, and as I walked, she kept shifting. I managed to sprint fast enough and get ahead of her, and that's when I saw him. There was a man crouching behind her, out of view. I remember seeing his body, hunched and ready to pounce. When I saw him, that's when everything sank in. They were trying to grab me. I'll never forget the face of that woman, and she went from cheerful and happy to sour in an instant. She dropped her nice act, slammed the door and sped off. As an adult, I'm convinced this was a planned act of opportunity, as around that time we'd had a series of kidnappings in my town, all kids my age, and reportedly with the same white cargo van. In this instance, they'd followed a bus and just waited for the perfect moment to strike. I could have easily been one of those missing kids on a milk box, and I still get chills when I think about it to this day. About a week or so ago, I went with my best friend's family to the zoo. I'm a 15-year-old female, and my friend is also, so we were allowed to roam the zoo on our own, as long as we kept watch over her little cousin, who was a 5-year-old boy. We were leaving the monkey exhibit, and were making our way back to their family, who were seated by the entrance to said exhibit, and the path that led back to the entrance didn't have many people by it, other than families that may have decided to take a break on one of the many benches. My friend was walking on the right of me, and her little cousin was walking to my left. My friend and I were talking, while her cousin was skipping next to us, when a shrill voice interrupted our conversation. "Oh, look at you! I could eat you up!" We looked over to a bench where an older woman who looked to be in her 60s and a man who looked to be in his early 30s were sitting. The lady was the one who had spoken, and her attention was on my friend's cousin. "You're a little chubby, but your hair is beautiful, baby." We gave the woman a tight smile, slowing our walk to allow the woman to keep on talking to the boy. Then the lady asked how old he was, and he politely responded with his correct age. The woman continued to ask simple things like his favourite colour and if he was enjoying the zoo, and we allowed it, as we didn't really have to be anywhere in a hurry. While the woman continued to ask questions, I looked over at the man next to her, who was studying me and my friend intensely. He looked away when we made eye contact, but his mouth curved into a creepy smirk as he turned and focused his attention on my friend's cousin. After another minute or so of questions, the little boy began to look bored and turned to me and my friend and asked if we were going to go back to his nana and auntie. I was going to respond, but the old lady spoke before I could. "Oh, don't you want to come home with me? I have a whole bunch of candy in my cabinet waiting for you. You can have it all if you come with me." The woman said this with a wide smile, and my friend's little cousin had a disgusted look on his face as he shook his head no and moved to be on the other side of my friend. As the old lady reached for his arm from where she was sitting, the woman and the man laughed at the boy's obvious discomfort, and my friend and I looked at each other, laughing along with the two of them awkwardly, before my friend grabbed her cousin's hand as we quickly walked away. Behind us we could hear the two of them still calling for the boy, and until we were reunited with her family, I kept looking over my shoulder for the pair. That was the last time that we saw the two of them. What do you guys think? I would like to think that they were just joking around, but I can't shake the feeling that those two wanted to do something a bit more devious with my friend's cousin. My mother always said to never go somewhere with strangers in promise of a treat or a surprise, and I'm glad the boy had known to say no. But what would have happened if the boy was alone and didn't know any better, or if any child was alone and didn't know better for that matter? When I was about 6 years old and in kindergarten or first grade, I can't remember which, we lived across the street from my school, literally opposite. From our front room window, the school property was the majority of what could be seen, and I went to this school until my second grade year, when it was shut down by the district. Most kids were shipped off to whatever school happened to be closest to them, and the abandoned property became a community centre of sorts for the town of less than 200 people or so. I won't drop the name of the town, but I will say that it is somewhere in rural Illinois, and that the estimated 200-person figure was in 1989. There are considerably fewer people now, as most of the population has either moved away or died, and several of the houses have burned down. Today the town is even more dried up than it was during my kindergarten years, and the last time I visited, it looked as though nature was beginning the process of reclaiming it. I say all of this because it's important that you understand how small this town was and is. People didn't just randomly show up there. Strangers would be immediately recognized, and there was nowhere for them to hide, because the town really only had 3 streets. All but the end of one of them led out of town, and the lone end of the lone street that didn't offer an escape route led to a dead end with an ancient old cemetery, another escape route in a manner of speaking. This town had nothing but a post office, a couple of abandoned buildings that I'm fairly certain used to be general stores back in the day, and a payphone. Today the post office is shut down, and the payphone is gone, so keep all this in mind when I say that a stranger or creep would have been noticed immediately. It's surprising, then, that I was almost abducted by a stranger in that town, and from directly in front of the school, no less. Actually, I think I was abducted, and that's the weird thing. When I left the school that day, the man was standing in front of his vehicle, and he greeted me by name. That's what makes this even weirder. He told me that my mum had sent him to pick me up for some reason or another, though the memory of what he actually said is a bit hazy. It amounted to, "Your mum isn't at home, she sent me to pick you up and take you where she is. Get in and we'll go for a ride." The usual creeper thing. I did as he asked. There are certain details I don't remember from this point. Like, why didn't I just look across the street to see if my mum's car was sitting in the driveway? But maybe I did. Where did we go? I don't know. What happened? I don't know. I have the briefest of memories of me sitting in the passenger seat of his vehicle and saying something as we drove out of town. I can't remember what he said, can't remember what he looked like, and I can't remember why my next memory is of us back in my driveway, in the house across from the school. There's just a large chunk of my memory that's gone. I don't know if there's something that I've blocked out for the last 33 years, as maybe he took me somewhere and did something to me that creeps do to young and trusting little boys, and I just locked it up inside. But I hope not. I hope he was some aspiring kidnapper with a conscience who just couldn't accept the enormity of the heinous sin he was about to commit and took me back home. That nothing bad happened to me, that my lack of memory is due more to the entire sequence of events being so uneventful, that my developing little brain felt no need to keep it in storage. I've often wondered if there's some way, like through some form of therapeutic hypnosis, like they show in movies and on TV, to unlock those memories, or even if that's a real thing, or if it is, if I even want to venture down that rabbit hole and discover what really happened. Maybe some things should just remain buried. I'm sure you've heard the expression, "Don't ask questions you don't want the answers to." Yeah, I feel that applies here, and maybe someone will tell me it was just a vivid dream that a young child had and remembered incorrectly as an actual memory. But this was not the case. A few years back, I actually asked my mum about it. "Do you remember when that strange man took me from the school and brought me back?" "Oh yes," she replied. Apparently, I'd told her what had happened, because she told me about how she'd gone over to the school and raised a bunch of hell over it, and that's all I have to prove even to myself that it ever even happened. Up until then, I had wondered if I had imagined the whole thing. This is unfortunately no longer something I can even attempt to convince myself is true. Who was this man? Why did he take me? Why did he bring me back? What happened that day? Now, I'm a big fan of horror, and I love a novel or a movie about monsters. I'm an avid fan of Stephen King and creepypasta. But it wasn't Pennywise the Dancing Clown or Slender Man that keep me up at night sometimes. No. It's the real monster who almost gobbled me up when I was 6 years old, and then lost his appetite. When I was younger, about 14 years ago, my family would take yearly trips to my grandparents' country for a few weeks. They live in a major city, and it was always fun to visit. A few days after we arrived at the city, a few of our cousins invited one of my sisters, who we'll call Em, and I to lunch at a very well-known restaurant. We've been doing this for a few years, and it was our little tradition. They were going to pick us up, but we told them to go ahead, and we would meet them there, as the restaurant was further away from them than us. So Em and I went out to hail a taxi, and the first one we saw was the one we took, but it gave me a bad vibe when I opened the door. I don't know how to explain it, but the interior looked different. It looked just like the main taxi service from that area, but the vehicle was an older model. I told Em, and she thought I was being snotty. I wasn't, by the way, and she told me to get in or we would be late. She got in first, and when I got in and made eye contact with the driver, it didn't feel right at all. Em told him where we wanted him to take us, and as we put on our seatbelts, I noticed his left shoulder drop a bit. Then I heard the doors lock and he proceeded to drive. I looked at him and asked him why he'd locked the doors. He stuttered a bit and said it's an automatic feature of the vehicle, that doors lock when the ignition was running and a door is opened and closed shut. But I was going to call out his BS. My door wasn't even closed shut. But Em gave me a dirty look and whispered that I was being rude. I decided not to tell him about the door and just held on to it for it to look closed and took off my seatbelt. About 3 blocks down, he turned onto a dead end when I went to tell him it was the wrong way. "No, it's not. I know where I'm going," he said. Then he turned, and sure enough, he did. He then had to turn around to get back onto the street we were on, and I asked him if he knew his way around. He replied in a snarky tone, telling me he did and that he knows the city very well. Em looked at me now, realizing something was off, so I gestured for her to take off her seatbelt, so she unbuckled it, but held it down like me so it looked like we still had them on. About 4 minutes later, but it seemed like hours, we turned onto the major street where the restaurant was, and it was only 2 blocks away. We were glad to see it, and to be honest, I started to feel like a jerk, thinking maybe I was wrong after all. But no, I wasn't. The restaurant was on the right side of us, so we told him to stop and that he could drop us off here. Em handed the driver the cash, but he looked at it, looked at us, and then said, "Sit down, shut up, or you'll regret it." Then made a sharp turn into the opposite direction of the restaurant and tried to turn into a narrow street. A van driver cut him off, which brought us to a complete stop as the van hadn't made a wide enough turn and was stuck. So I took my chance and flung the door open, pulled Em by the arm and yelled at her to run. We bolted out of the taxi as the driver was trying to take off his seatbelt. He yelled at us to get back in the car and began to chase us. There were only about 3 vehicles on the road, and really no one out on the street. But as soon as we got close to the restaurant, there was more life. I was still running when I turned and noticed he'd stopped and was just giving us a dirty look. He then ran back to his taxi and took off down the narrow street. Finally arriving at the restaurant, we found our cousins and went back home. Once there, we told our family what had happened, and my dad and uncles went out to the taxi station to find out who this guy was. It turned out that the taxi company had no idea who it was, and when my dad told them about the vehicle, they told him they had stopped using those years ago and updated their fleet. After that, we stopped taking taxis and either drove ourselves or a relative would take us where we needed to go. To this day, we still have no idea who it was or what he wanted, but it's made me even more aware of my gut feelings. When I was in elementary school, my walk to and from there was pretty far. It was a little over a mile, which felt like a lot when you're just a kid. And I lived right before the barrier of where the kids who got to take the bus lived, so I was the only kid walking home for the last several blocks, as most kids who walked lived close or had parents to pick them up or drop them off. I was a latchkey kid, so I was responsible for getting myself to and from school. I took the same route every day, and there were some familiar faces that I had gotten to know. An old couple going on afternoon walks together, a friend's mum always gardening in her front yard, and a man in an old red car that would always wave to me as he drove by. The man in the red car was always recognizable to me, because he looked a little like Lance Bass with the 90s frosted tips, and he drove the same car, model, year and colour, as my dad at the time. He always seemed friendly, so I always waved back at him, and I assumed he was a classmate's dad since he was always driving the same route that I took home. But I should have realized that didn't make sense, because he never had a kid in his car, and I never saw him actually picking up any kids from my school. But I guess that's what being a dumb kid does to you. One day I was walking home and was in tears the whole way. Obviously so. I was bawling my eyes out. I can't remember why, but my only focus was getting home, so I could cry in my room in peace and watch cartoons. And this was the day that the man in the red car stopped whilst driving by me. I was really upset, so I didn't stop to wave back at him at this time. I just angrily walked ahead, and that's when I heard him call out. This was the first time he'd ever gone further than just waving and smiling, and he called out a "hey" for a second time and gave me a friendly wave. That's when I stopped and said hello back. He was parked by the curb with his passenger side window down, the window closest to me on the sidewalk, and he was leaning over. He gave me a big smile, then immediately put on this really sad and distraught face. He told me his puppy was missing, and he was out looking for it. He asked me to come in his car to help him look. I remember him specifically telling me his dog had spots and a little pink nose. And I hesitated for a moment, as my love of dogs made my dumbass consider this. But I remember being too upset to want to help, and I wanted to just go home. I sniffled and told him that I'd look for him when I walked, and asked what his dog's name was. And that's when his face went from the fake distraught look to one of annoyance. I remember he cranked the car window closed, right in my face, and drove off quickly, and I now felt even more upset. The thought that I hadn't helped him with his lost puppy made me just run the rest of the way home, and I curled up in bed. I didn't tell my mum about what happened, because at the time I legitimately thought that he was just a dude trying to find his lost dog. However, it wasn't until I was a teen and the memory came back to me that I realized how bad that could have gone, and I thanked the universe that whatever upset me did so, because it meant that I didn't help that guy. I saw him maybe a few more times that school year, but he never waved and smiled at me again. So this story happened about a year ago, and it's important to note that I am also a girl, so this was a scary and potentially dangerous situation for both of us. One night after work, just after it had become dark, my girlfriend stopped at the Walmart neighborhood market down the road, which by the way is next to a big highway interstate, so I could make a last-minute run to the bank. But right as I was pulling out of the bank, I got a text from her saying she thought she was being followed. I asked her for more details, told her not to leave the store, and that I was going to drive up to the front door and either watch her get to her car or have her get in mine if she needed. She told me that there were two men that she kept seeing in every single aisle, and that they were usually behind her. They were very clearly staring at her each time and watching her very closely, and she thought she was just being paranoid. But I told her to trust her gut, and that she should let a worker know about the situation and even call the police, because it wasn't worth the risk. Before I had made it all the way there, she texted me she was at the checkout and said that the guys had followed her there and went to a self-checkout near her, but with no items. They quickly grabbed some gum from the shelf and put it into a Walmart sack, but they just stood there taking forever to cash the item out and kept watching her and waiting for her to finish. I told her to check out as slowly as humanely possible, at which point I finally arrived. She had just texted me that they'd finally taken their bag and exited the store. However, right as I pulled up, I saw two guys that perfectly matched her description of them, and they were hiding in a little cutout near the entrance. They were just standing there and kept peeking around the corner at the front door every single time someone exited. I knew they were looking for her. I pulled my car forward, right in front of them, and literally rolled down my window, just so I could stare into their souls. I didn't look away, and I wanted to make sure that even though they didn't know I had anything to do with her, that I got a very, very good look at their faces and was watching them. I texted her and told her not to return to her car, but to get straight into mine. Right then they started walking off, but they'd had to have been following her since she'd arrived, because the next thing they did was walk straight to her car. Now her car is very unique and stands out. They dropped their bag on the ground on the way to her car, and one of them went between her car and the one next to it and squatted down by the trunk. The next one walked over to a white work van with painted windows and no license plate. He spoke to someone that was in the driver's seat, and while this was happening, one of the cars next to hers left. They then pulled the van up into that spot. I called her and told her to go straight to my car, and to not even look at hers, as they were there waiting for her with a van. She came out with groceries, and they saw her squatting down and laying in wait. We quickly loaded up the shopping and she got in my car. Then the men stood up and walked to the van as I pulled away and tried to go around them to catch a license plate number. But of course there wasn't one. I drove in a totally different direction from home, just driving around for a while. I wanted to make sure no one was following us, and also to give them time to leave her car alone. I wanted to call the cops, but she was convinced we were just seeing things that weren't there, like we were taking coincidences and making them into something. Obviously, looking back though, and after having talked in depth about both of our experiences, we definitely should have called the cops, and I regret that. I've since seen the van with the same two guys driving it, back in the neighborhoods behind the Walmart. I was turning onto the street they were turning off of, still no license plate. But their van had more things on the exterior to make it look like a work van. Things like a ladder on the roof, etc. I got so creeped out that I quickly tried to get away, just in case they turned around and tried to come for me, so I floored it home. Again, I thought about calling the police. But what was I going to say? Yeah, there's two men driving away from a neighborhood with a work van. Go get them. They don't even take most things seriously, even when it results in something actually happening. I just truly hope there is a valid explanation for all of their actions, and that I just came to the conclusion that we were just being dramatic. But I don't know. Maybe they waited at the front, because they didn't see their buddy with the van and thought he might be inside. Her car is very cool, so maybe they just liked it and were looking at it. Maybe they just wanted to steal parts off of it. Maybe there's a rational explanation, but I don't think so. It doesn't explain them following her or getting gum in a bag just to drop it in the parking lot. Luckily, I haven't heard of any kidnappings coming out of that Walmart, but who knows? I haven't been digging for it, but I do know that I'm extra cautious now and try not to go out past dark. I also scan the parking lot for the van before I go in, but normally I just do the curbside pickup now, and my girlfriend does the same thing. This is a story about my friend Lily and myself, who lived here in Iowa. And in Iowa, if there's land, there's corn. Lily lived on the outskirts of town, so it wasn't hard to get out by cornfields. She had lied to me about her mother giving us permission to leave the house, and she said she wanted to go to the Human Society. We knew where it was, but it was incredibly far away, and would have been a long, long walk. Her mother wasn't home when we left, and she came back to an empty house. When we reached the main highway, there were some stores to the left, and to the right was corn. And though there was a road that came out of the field and went across the highway, I wouldn't call it an intersection, because this was a gravel road that then turned into a normal road. But there was this guy we noticed, who was going down that very suspicious gravel road. A man then crossed the highway, but stopped when he got onto that road, somewhere that led to God knows where, and he stopped right in front of us. He was in a lowrider pickup that looked like your casual hillbilly pickup, but his arm was in a cast, and he had a splint on it. At first I was thinking, why is this man driving when he can hardly move his arm? But he then rolled down his window and asked, "Where are you two girls going?" "Oh, just the Human Society," Lily said. Then that's when he asked if we needed a ride. My friend almost accepted his offer, but I tightly grabbed her shoulder and told the man we would be fine. He nodded and pulled forward, but then stopped again and said, "You sure? I can get you there." I glared at this old-ass man and said yet again, "We are fine." Then he slowly drove off, still watching us as we turned around and ran to the dollar store. Bolting across the highway was dangerous, but we made it. We were going to have them call the cops, but we chickened out and just decided to go home. But not long after we left the Dollar General, her mother called me, yelling aggressively and asking us where we were. I was confused and told her that she'd said it was okay, and then had me hand Lily the phone. She then proceeded to cuss her out, and I never did tell her what had happened. God knows what that man would have done if we'd gotten into that truck. The reason why she'd called me was because Lily had her phone on silent and wasn't answering at all, but luckily she happened to have my number. Before we left, she called her mum and she didn't answer, but then told me that she'd texted her that it was okay. We were about 13 at the time. Now I'm 17, and I haven't hung out with her since then. I'll never forget that creepy old man. I was about 7 or 8 years old at the time of this story, and my parents were on staff with this mega church. We lived in a house directly across the street from it, and it was huge. It also had a private school that I had attended from kindergarten to 4th grade. I had just recently joined some little cheerleading group, and there was an event after school that kept me there later than usual. My parents attended the event, but afterwards left me on campus because I'd asked to stay and play longer with my neighborhood friend, and I was instructed to walk home, just across the street, once the parking lot lights had turned on. So we were running around a big soccer field when I noticed the lights had come on and it was time for me to start walking home. The friend I was with lived the street just behind my house, but she had a bike with her and was quickly out of sight. I was at the entrance of the parking lot and about to cross the street when a white pickup truck stopped directly in front of me. I remember thinking that it was a really weird place for a car to stop, so I didn't cross the street because I wasn't sure if they'd even seen me, so I was worried that maybe I'd get hit. I then noticed the man in the driver's seat was staring at me, directly into my eyes. My stomach dropped when he began motioning with his hand to come here. I froze and said no under my breath. He then swung open the passenger door and started patting his lap for me to get on it. But he had a white button shirt on and no pants. I said no, and he looked around and appeared to be shifting towards me, to grab me, I assume. Then right then a family friend and the literal last person at the church stepped out to lock the church's front doors. He saw her and sped off, so I ran to her and cried so hard that she took me into her car and held me. A cop promptly came to my house and interviewed me, and my dad and older brother scouted the neighborhood for a white pickup truck, but we never found him. That was over 20 years ago, and I can still clearly see his face. I'm a female from Minnesota, and this story took place a few years back when I was 21. During this time, I worked as a cashier at a big corporation, just to earn some extra money. And also because I wanted to become more extroverted, as I'm very shy, and thought being forced to talk to people would help. About 4 months into working there, I was working at around 7 at night, up front, as I always did, and the crowds were slowing down. There was this fellow at the back of the line. Not much was out of the ordinary about him, and when it was his turn in line, we had a very pleasant conversation. I even complimented him on the unique dragon tattoo on his forearm. It was black, curled up and very pretty despite being a bit faded. The only thing that made me a bit uncomfortable, however, was how dark his eyes were. You couldn't even see his pupils, but I put it down to my anxiety messing with my head. Just then an older man walked up and stood behind the guy I was checking out, and they exchanged looks. The man with the tattoo introduced himself as Aaron, then smiled brightly at me before asking a question that startled me. "We're having a barbecue at my house. It's just a mile down the road. You want to come? What time do you get off?" Now I get called a 13 to 15-year-old by my friends and strangers, even though I'm in my mid-20s, and red flags popped up all over the place. I tried to think of any excuse I could to not make them suspicious of me or have them try to wait around until I got off of work, which was in a little under an hour from then. I did what I learned from watching Bee Buster, Corpse Husband, and all of the other horror narrators that I listen to daily. And with a huge smile on my face, I lied through my teeth. "Oh, that sounds like fun. I don't get off until 10. Would that be too late?" They looked pleased and kept their eyes locked on my face as the older gentleman nodded. Aaron paid for his stuff and his friends started grabbing the bags, loading them up in the cart. Then they left with the promise of being back around 10. And I said I couldn't wait to try the food and hang out. Obviously I told my manager, and I was allowed to call my ride to let them know I would be escorted outside by security, and meeting me by the door would be the best idea. To be honest, I did feel like I overreacted, as maybe they were just trying to be nice. However, that thought was disproved in my mind 2 weeks later, when I was back behind the cash register on a busy day. I was barely paying attention to who I was ringing up, until I looked up to tell the person their total. Aaron was there with his eyes locked on me, and I didn't even recognize him until I saw his dragon tattoo. That unique image that has been haunting my thoughts and making me question my anxiety. Forcing a smile, I told him his total and asked how the barbecue was, and my voice didn't hide the guard I put up this time. The smile on his face was not kind, and his eyes were darker than before. "It would have been better if you were there." He looked me over, took his groceries, and threw another glance at me over his shoulder. The smile was gone. "See you around," he said. I quit that job a month later. My mum still works there, and I gave her his description. I hope to God that she never runs into him, though, as she also looks young and is smaller than me. "Aaron, while I like your tattoo, don't try that stuff on anyone else, and I'm glad I rejected your invite." So this happened about 4 years ago when I was 25. I'm 5 foot tall, 100 pounds, and I'm an easy target when alone. I had gone to Macy's alone to pick up an online order in my brand new car and was afraid of door dings, so I parked a little farther out where no other cars were close by, but not very far. I was within view of the front door still. It was around 6 p.m, so the mall was kind of dead anyway, and there were about 300 other free parking spots. I walked into Macy's to get my order and headed out, and I was in the store for about 3 minutes total. I went to leave and walk out the doors, when I looked up at my car and my heart stopped. I could see a large black pickup truck with deep black tinted windows now parked directly next to my car, so close that I wouldn't have been able to open my driver's side door. and the driver of this truck was outside of his vehicle and had both of his hands on the hood of my car. He then spotted me and quickly faced me with his arms crossed, as if he was waiting for me. I had a sinking feeling he was up to no good, but being the dumb 25-year-old that I was, I walked a little bit closer to my car, weaving between other vehicles to make it look like I was going somewhere else, and thought maybe he'd hit my car and was waiting for me. As I got closer, I saw there was no such damage, but the man was still watching me with crossed arms. I knew this wasn't going to end well, so I pressed the panic button on my key fob, and I was shaking terribly. As soon as I pushed that button, the man ran into his vehicle and literally sped out of the parking lot, going at least 45 miles an hour. I ran to my car and drove home, crying and shaking, and when I got there I tried to call the mall and ask for a copy of the security tape and if they could help me in any way in filing a complaint, but they weren't very helpful. Looking back, I should have called the police. I still haven't talked to anyone in my life about it, because I'm ashamed it happened to me, and I don't feel like getting lectured from them about the ramifications of me being a single female. I truly believe this man was sitting in this parking lot just watching and waiting for an easy target. Whether he was going to rob my car or abduct me, I don't know. I live in a state with human trafficking spots, but I think he saw me park and go into the store and immediately moved his car in a position to block me from getting into my own vehicle upon return. As I'd only been in the store for 3 minutes, there's no way this transpired innocently, and the manner in which he fled, and I mean fled, when I pressed my panic alarm is concerning. Could there have been any other explanation? Has anyone else had something like this happen? This happened years ago in 2017. I was 22 at the time and living in my car with my dog. We were in Idaho visiting a friend, but he had college during the day, so I usually just drove around until he was finished. This particular day, though, I decided to drive to a state park that's 40 minutes out of the city, just because it looked beautiful online, and I love nature. It was just at sunset, and when I arrived there were only 2 cars left. They were parked near each other and belonged to 2 guys that looked like dads that were just shooting the breeze. Now, being homeless and introverted, I parked on the very edge of the parking lot nearest to the water. I felt okay whilst they were there, but soon after I parked up, the 2 dads left and I was then alone in the park, and it was just after sunset. Since I had my dog with me, a Pomeranian and my very best friend at the time, I decided to walk her along the water's edge so she could pee. After a few minutes of being outside, another car pulled into the lot, and as it was getting dark, the headlights immediately caught my eye. At first I didn't care. It was a public state park, and there was a whole empty parking lot. But I started to get uneasy when they parked almost adjacent to me. Trying to soothe my anxiety, I told myself that it was just because they might have felt better parking next to someone else. But then 2 men stepped out of the car and were staring right at me. They were whispering to each other and wouldn't take their eyes off me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and my paranoia got the best of me in the moment. So I rushed my dog to the car, and as soon as I got inside, I locked the doors and started to drive out towards the exit. But I wanted to take photos, so I decided I truly was overreacting and drove to the other end of the park. And that's when I realized that the 2 men had started up their car again and were following me. Deciding I wasn't being paranoid anymore, I drove as fast as I could out of there and sped all the way back to the nearest busy shopping area, camping out in a McDonald's parking lot until I felt sure they hadn't followed me. Maybe I did overreact, but I'm just glad I didn't take any chances. I live in a very touristic city from Mexico, in one of the most violent states in the country, so teenagers are usually very cautious, especially women, and sadly it's become almost necessary for us girls to have a guy with us at all times so that weirdos won't try anything. A few months before the quarantine started in 2019, I was 18 years old, I'm now 19, and I was just getting out of school and heading to the bus stop with a male friend, when I noticed a grey Toyota truck driving slowly. It was not too close, but not too far away from us, so I didn't really think anything of it, and just kept chatting to my friend, until we got to the bus stop, and when we said goodbye and he went home. Now I was new in that school, as I'd failed 11th grade and had to repeat the course in another school. I don't know if the educational system works the same way where you guys live, but here we have 2 or 3 different schedules for school. The best students get sent to the morning schedule, the average go to the afternoon schedule, and the terrible ones that failed or are pregnant or something like that go to the nocturnal schedule. I was studying in the morning schedule, but as I'd failed, they said they would send me to the afternoon one. But my mum refused this, so she sent me to another school that only had a morning schedule. In my last school, the bus stop was always very crowded, so we never had to worry about someone weird hanging around, because we were never alone. However, in this new school I didn't have any friends who took the same bus as me, or even took any bus. My best friend that I mentioned before lived near the school, so he would just walk me to the bus stop every day, and then make his way home. So once I was left alone, I spotted that same grey truck driving slowly behind me in the parking lot. Then it doubled back and started driving to the front of the bus stop, where I was awkwardly standing. Out of the corner of my eye I could see the driver. He was some guy with a black snapback and black sunglasses on, and he caught me staring and grinned creepily. You lot have no idea how awful things get in this country, so I was expecting the worst already. Thankfully though, my bus was arriving, so I quickly climbed in and could relax a bit. Getting off at my destination, I hopped off, and when I noticed we were reaching the bus stop from the middle school I used to go to, I saw the same damn truck approaching me. Some other random car got in the way though, so they drove a bit further. Then one of the guys from the truck hopped off as I ran to a corner. I was hoping that because there were some other kids around they wouldn't dare do anything, but I was wrong. The bald guy that was rounding the corner where he spotted me said, "No need to be scared, güerita." That's Spanish for girls who are very light-skinned, white or blonde. Forget this, I thought, and ran back to the sidewalk and stopped a random bus. I climbed in and pushed some lady and her little girl out of the way to get in. She got mad and told me to slow down, but once I'd regained my breath, I apologized to her and told her I was being followed. She gave me an awkward smile and said it was okay. Then I got home safely with my keys in hand, still occasionally looking around just to make sure no one was following me. I didn't dare walk into my house, just in case I was being followed. They'd then know where I lived, so I just walked to the local park until I thought it'd be okay and called my parents. Now I'm a person who panics at the mere idea of these things happening. Imagine if I'd just frozen and these guys were able to take me. I would be either some pimp's bitch, dead, tortured, or be missing some organs. The best case scenario would be that I'd get forced to sell drugs. But needless to say, I hate this country, and I'm studying hard to make money and move to London. One thing I don't miss from pre-quarantine days is having to worry about stranger danger. When I was in 11th grade, I had a taxi driver who would drive me to school and drop me off at home every day. He seemed nice at first, and we always had some pretty good conversations. For the first few weeks, he was actually one of my favourite people, and just seemed like a cool guy in general. However, one day things started to get a bit weird. He began telling me stories about what happens to girls on dark web videos, and I stayed completely silent, because what the actual hell? Then he gave me a pair of his glasses and made me try them on. He actually made me try on several pairs, and he even put his hand on my leg multiple times. He actually had the audacity to give me his number and Facebook completely without me prompting it. Now let me just remind you all that at this time I was 17, and this dude was in his 40s and had a wife and kids too. He also kept begging me to let him teach me karate at his house, and all of this was happening over the course of about a month. The tipping point was when he actually sent me a message on Facebook, telling me how beautiful I looked in a picture. I told my parents, which I should have done right from the start, and I blocked him. My parents proceeded to call the taxi company to report him. But the kicker is that this particular taxi service was specifically for minors going to school. But wait, there's more. About a month went by and I got a different driver, who was much better and not creepy at all. Things were fine, until I walked out of school one day, and the creepy taxi driver was right there, in the parking lot in his car waiting for me. But because I didn't know it was him, I went straight up to the car to get in. Obviously, when I saw his face, I stopped myself and said, "Sorry, I forgot something," then ran back into the school. He didn't look normal that day either. His eyes were red as if he had been on drugs, and his beard was completely full, when he always kept it shaved. He kept making strange grunting noises in the few seconds I was there. My parents were obviously furious that he'd showed up, and they called the taxi company again, and the manager of the company said that it was probably just an accident in their system. But I don't believe them at all. I feel like if I'd gotten in that car that day, I would have been kidnapped or hurt for sure. I'm not sure what prompted me to write this down and post it today, but I did. This is the story of what happened on a trip back in 2017, when a good friend and I went on a trip to Banff. We both had some time off, so figured we'd make a bit of a vacation out of it. We checked out the hot springs in town there, and were also told about some other less frequented hot springs by locals we had met. From Banff we headed to Nelson, BC, stopping at a natural hot spring along the way. I've forgotten the name of it, but it was under a waterfall, near Radium, I believe. Nelson was nice, and we stayed there for the night. Then we went to Ainsworth, kayaked out on the lake, and then from there headed down to a place called Nakosp, on recommendation of someone we had met in Nelson, to check out the halfway hot springs. This is where it got incredibly creepy. On this particular day it was very windy, to the point that trees had fallen, and we had to maneuver around them on the road. My friend was driving and I was the passenger, and we made it to the dirt road which was to take us down to the hot springs. This place was remote, and in a dense forest, one road in and one road out. I don't think there was another way in, but I'm not certain, but it definitely didn't seem that way. As we got a little further down this road, we ended up with two vehicles in front of us, and stuck at a blockage where a tree was lying across the road. Luckily, and looking back very oddly, there was a guy with a chainsaw who had been coming the opposite way. So as he chopped the tree up, we helped him load the box of his truck with the logs. Of the two vehicles on our side of the blockage, there was a car with a young couple, two Australian travellers, and the other was an older lone male in a pickup truck that had a canopy on the box of it and a mattress in the back. It had a winch on the front of the truck too. I thought nothing of any of this at the time. We were just buzzing to be getting closer to our destination. We finished up, then the chainsaw guy carried on heading out in the opposite direction, and we and the other two vehicles continued down towards the hot springs. Not much further down though, we encountered another blockage. Only this time there was no guy with a chainsaw. The guy with the winch on his truck attempted to drag it out, but to no avail, as it was wedged in between trees on both sides. He did, however, have a hatchet in his truck, which me and my friend used to take turns on hacking through the middle. Realizing this was going to take time they didn't have, the Australian couple turned around and left, when at some point after, another vehicle came from the opposite direction, and it was a guy and his girlfriend, who would have been well and truly stuck if we went already halfway through cutting up the blockage. The guy helped us take turns of hacking at the tree, as his girlfriend stayed in their truck, and the lone guy at this point was making small talk with the guy who had just arrived. I remember him asking if they were the last people at the Hotsprings, and then specifically said, other than the blonde with dreads. Now this should have been an alarm bell moment looking back, but again we were just eager to get to the Hotsprings. We finally got through the tree, hooked up the winch, and pulled the pieces aside. At this point he was the hero, as we would have never gotten through without the aid of the hatchet and winch, and anyone on the other side wouldn't have been able to get out. We continued down the hot spring, and the guy sped off ahead. Arriving at the car park not long after, we noticed there was one car parked, a smaller white hatchback type car, obviously the guy's truck, and that was it. We changed into our shorts, I rolled a joint, and we started to walk down the trail, which is down a reasonably steep hill. We were no more than 5 minutes behind this guy, but as we got to the top of the trail, he was already walking back up. He passed us and said something along the lines of, "I usually do it quicker than that," which, not knowing how long it took to get down, we didn't think much of. Then a few minutes later, as we were a little further down, a lone girl passed us, so we said hi, then continued down the trail. Again, not thinking anything was off at that point, it took maybe 20 minutes to get from the car park to the hot springs, and we spent about half hour, maybe 40 minutes down there. We had a dip in the pools, took some photos, then it began to get dark, so we headed back up. However, the trip back up was a bit eerie, as it had gotten considerably darker, but we still had decent visibility. Then as we got back up to the car park, we noticed the one car still there, which just didn't sit well with us. There was one door slightly ajar, the back right if I remember correctly, but nobody was inside or anywhere to be seen. We didn't really put two and two together though until we were back on the dirt road, and I think it was a pretty simultaneous realization as to what may have just happened. It all began to make too much sense. Why did this guy go to so much effort in the first place to get past the fallen trees? He'd spent well over an hour doing so, to literally turn back around and leave. I know he knew there was a girl there, as I had heard him say previously to the couple coming the other way. It was all a bit too much to mean nothing, so where could she have possibly gone? There was nothing around us at all, and it went from being a beautiful place out in the sticks and feeling free, to having a vibe of wanting nothing more than to be back in the city. It was like something from a horror movie unfolding in front of us. I'll never forget that day. I just hope we were being paranoid. But I can't see how these things all add up to mean nothing. What do you think? Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.